A top-secret U.S. military base. Triple-fenced perimeter, armed guards, motion sensors, and yet, all it took to compromise it was a piece of bubblegum. Not a bomb, not a weapon, not even a wiretap. Just gum. In the height of the Cold War, a Soviet spy used a child's candy to outwit America's finest. And the scariest part? No one noticed until it was too late. The year was 1976. Somewhere in the Nevada desert, behind classified coordinates and locked gates, sat a base so restricted, its very name was redacted. It housed experimental tech, military prototypes, and secrets the Soviets were desperate to uncover. But this isn't a story about stolen documents or high-speed chases. It's about how routine became a weakness, and how one of the strangest hacks in espionage history began with something sticky, sweet, and utterly invisible to the guards sworn to protect the nation's most guarded secrets. He did not look like a spy, and that was precisely the point. No trench coat, no foreign accent thick enough to linger, no nervous glances that might betray calculation. On paper, he was simply Alexander Ivanovich Petrov, a name so common it dissolved into paperwork, attached to a cover that was even less remarkable. A civilian maintenance subcontractor assigned to regional infrastructure projects that happened to overlap with military zones. During the Cold War, the most valuable operatives were not the brilliant or the bold, but the forgettable, and Petrov had been selected for exactly that quality. He was in his late 30s, average height, thinning hair, a posture shaped by manual labor rather than military drill. His clothing was practical and dull, the kind that never lingered in memory. Work boots scuffed at the toe, faded jackets, neutral colors. When he spoke, it was rarely more than necessary, and when he listened, he nodded just enough to appear attentive without inviting conversation. Guards saw him often enough to stop seeing him at all. That was the goal. Intelligence doctrine on both sides of the Iron Curtain had reached the same conclusion by the 1970s. Routines were more valuable than secrets. A man who belonged inside a system, even peripherally, could extract more over time than one who forced his way in. Petrov's assignments brought him repeatedly to the outer service corridors near the base, power junctions, access roads, utility sheds, places that existed in the gray zone between civilian and military responsibility. He carried the right paperwork, stamped and signed by offices no one at the gate bothered to call anymore because they never had before. The first few times, guards checked his badge closely, flipped through his documents, asked him questions. By the 10th visit, they waved him through without looking up. By the 20th, they greeted him with bored familiarity. He became part of the background noise of the base, as expected as the hum of generators or the dust that crept in from the desert. Petrov understood something the KGB drilled into its operatives relentlessly. Suspicion fades faster than memory. Once someone is classified as harmless, reclassifying them as a threat requires effort, and effort is the one thing routine environments resist. He never hurried. He never lingered where he didn't belong. He arrived when scheduled, left when finished, complained mildly about heat or equipment like any other contractor. He learned names, not to use them, but to recognize who rotated through which posts and when. He noticed which guards ate lunch at the same time every day, which ones smoked, which ones leaned their weight against doors or rested hands on switches without thinking. None of this required espionage brilliance. It required patience. Soldiers stopped questioning him because nothing about him demanded a question. And in a system built on procedures rather than curiosity, that made him invisible. By the time anyone might have wondered who he really was, the habit of ignoring him had already hardened into policy. And Petrov, the spy no one noticed, had achieved the most dangerous position of all, being exactly where he was expected to be. The base had all the hallmarks of invincibility: rows of fencing topped with barbed wire, entry points with armed guards, watchtowers spaced with tactical precision, and the cold hum of early electronic surveillance systems meant to detect any breach of its sacred perimeter. But what it truly had, what it unknowingly depended on, was habit. Like all institutions with rigid structures, its strength became its weakness the moment patterns began repeating. Guards rotated on a fixed schedule. Their patrol paths traced the same rectangles over and over until their boots knew the turns better than their minds. At 0600 hours, shift change at the north gate. At 0615, the first sweep past the storage hangars. At 0640, a pause at checkpoint Echo, where the corporal always lit a cigarette, same hand, same pocket, same brand. The daily rhythm of the base was not just visible, it was mechanical. Switches were flipped in order, doors unlocked in sequence, access panels opened and resecured, with such regularity that they became muscle memory. Every action was logged, yes, but rarely analyzed unless something went wrong. And nothing ever had. Routines conferred the illusion of safety. Guards knew to check IDs, to log entries, to nod at familiar faces. But they did not question the reliability of the system they followed. Inside the base, the security culture operated less like a military installation and more like a machine designed to run without friction. Once someone passed a security check, the assumption of legitimacy traveled with them. Contractors wore color-coded badges that signaled level of access, and once those badges were verified, they became visual passwords. Petrov, with his dull gray credentials and clipboard, belonged to the class of personnel granted unsupervised access to utility corridors, a category that, over time, was treated less as a security concern and more as a maintenance nuisance. The physical systems of the base, its locks, its alarms, its access terminals, were rarely tested under adversarial conditions. They were used exactly as intended, every day, by people who believed they were among allies, and therein lay the danger. Security at the base did not depend on unpredictability. It depended on everything going according to plan. No one thought to question whether the outer junction box should always click twice before the generator engaged. No one noticed that the screws on the maintenance panel near the eastern conduit were stripped and retightened far too often. Guards signed forms without reading them because the forms always said the same thing. And most critically, everyone followed orders handed down by people who followed orders before them, creating a lineage of complacency dressed up as procedure. Petrov understood this before he ever set foot inside. It wasn't the strength of the walls that interested him. It was the blind spots created by ritual. Every base has them, not because its people are foolish, but because familiarity dulls suspicion. And once a pattern is established, especially a pattern masked as discipline, all it takes to exploit it is to behave exactly like everyone else. It started the way small problems always do, annoying, inconsistent, and easy to ignore. The first report came from one of the junior maintenance staff assigned to check the external relay housing near the generator shed on the south end of the base. He logged a minor obstruction in the locking mechanism. "Foreign adhesive," he wrote, a vague phrase that passed without notice through the maintenance logs. 2 days later, the same type of complaint surfaced from a guard stationed at entry gate 3. The panel covering the manual override wouldn't sit flush, like something sticky had been jammed inside. Again, it was cleaned, reset, forgotten. But by the third instance, this time in the stairwell access panel leading to the communications substation, the pattern was becoming harder to dismiss. Each event involved something oddly juvenile, yet undeniably obstructive. A smear of gum, chewed and pliable, sometimes wedged under a hinge, sometimes pressed onto the edge of a release. Latch, other times simply stuck in a place where it did not belong. No one suspected espionage. Instead, they suspected the contractors. Someone not taking their work seriously. Someone being careless, or worse, unsanitary. A quiet reprimand was issued during the next site-wide contractor briefing. "Clean up after yourselves," barked the base's logistics officer. No names were given, no accusations made, but privately, irritation was mounting. One technician began carrying alcohol wipes specifically for cleaning control surfaces. A sergeant joked about posting bubblegum bans like a middle school hallway. But for all the chatter, no one thought to ask why anyone would be placing gum inside sealed panels that no human should have any reason to touch unless they were opening or manipulating them. It wasn't sabotage. The gum never stopped anything outright, but it left residue. It clung to grooves. It slowed down mechanical responses by half a second, barely noticeable to the untrained eye. It softened under heat, stiffened in cold. It was never the same color twice, sometimes pink, sometimes white, once even a dark purple that matched no brand sold on base. That small detail should have raised flags, but it didn't. What mattered to the personnel was that the gum was gross, and they wanted it gone. To the guards, it was a childish prank. To the officers, a nuisance. Only one man, an aging communications tech, wondered aloud whether it was a test. "Who chews gum inside a restricted corridor?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone. No one listened. The assumption remained simple. It was just trash. Something careless, something human. No one questioned the locations, the frequency, or the growing consistency of the placement. And certainly, no one considered that the gum wasn't there by accident. It was being used, deployed, applied, like a tool. And in the quiet, unnoticed places where security was trusted but not checked, where the daily grind dulled alertness into muscle memory, the bubblegum was doing exactly what it was meant to do, measuring reactions, recording friction, testing response times, and slowly prying open the rhythms of a base that didn't yet know it was being watched. The gum wasn't an accident, it was data. Alexander Petrov, who had spent years learning the mechanical language of locks, switches, and hinges, understood that even the most secure systems behaved like living organisms when placed under stress. And the trick to exploiting them wasn't brute force. It was observation, subtle manipulation, and the quiet art of feedback collection. By embedding chewed gum in precise locations, door edges, latch grooves, switch toggles, he wasn't sabotaging anything. He was studying the base the way a safecracker studies a vault, not by opening it outright, but by listening to the clicks, the resistance, the way it breathes under pressure. A bit of gum pressed under the lip of a mechanical access panel would slightly misalign the closure, and Petrov could return days later to examine whether it had been pried, cleaned, or ignored. If it remained untouched, he knew that corner of the base was rarely checked. If it was hastily scraped away, he's measured reaction time. If residue was still present, he knew what cleaning agents were used, what standard tools were issued, how much force had been applied. Every deployment gave him insight into procedure without ever crossing a security threshold. Sometimes, he rolled the gum into a tiny ball and wedged it behind a spring-loaded mechanism, causing the latch to close a fraction slower than normal. If a technician opened the panel and noticed nothing, that delay, perhaps a half second, became valuable. It told Petrov how tolerant the system was to resistance. In a world before digital fingerprints and cyber espionage, this was hacking in its purest form, probing the environment with disposable tools and interpreting the results like a scientist in a lab. Chewed gum was perfect, malleable, pressure-sensitive, non-conductive, and utterly beneath suspicion. No one looked twice at discarded candy, especially not when it showed up in just enough places to be considered annoyance, not threat. But Alexander kept detailed records, disguised in banal reports submitted as part of his contractor duties. When filing paperwork on minor alignment irregularities in utility boxes, he embedded small annotations, a pattern of spacing, a code derived from the number of vowels used in each sentence, a shadow language that transformed routine inspection forms into espionage logs. He cross-referenced these notes with his own movement logs, tracking which placements were cleaned within hours and which lasted days. Each sticky mark was a probe, and each reaction gave him what he needed: response times, cleaning schedules, patrol frequencies, human error rates. It was surveillance without cameras, intrusion without breach, and no one, not one guard, officer, or technician, considered that the gum might be intentional. That was the genius. They were all focused on what the gum was doing: slowing doors, jamming panels, annoying maintenance staff. No one asked what it was, telling someone else. In Alexander's hands, the cheapest, most childish material on the planet became a feedback device, a pressure sensor, a probe, a trigger. The gum was never meant to break the system. It was designed to reveal it. And the base, secure on paper but lazy in practice, was slowly telling its secrets to the man who knew how to listen with his fingertips. Alexander Petrov never once entered a restricted vault, opened a classified document, or placed a bug beneath a general's desk. And yet, with nothing more than patience, paper, and strategically placed gum, he gave Soviet intelligence exactly what it needed most: the rhythms of the enemy. It wasn't about stealing files or breaching safes. It was about understanding the invisible choreography that governed the base. When the guards moved, how long systems stayed active before reset, which doors required a badge override, and which could be trailed through behind someone distracted. By recording how long it took for each piece of gum to be noticed and removed, or not noticed at all, Petrov built a timetable of base activity down to the hour. If a piece stuck to a relay cover disappeared within the same 2-hour window 3 times in a row, he knew when the inspection occurred. If another mark remained untouched for a full 72 hours, he learned which zones were blind to oversight. Over weeks, then months, this information layered into a map more valuable than any blueprint. a behavioral blueprint. Patrol paths weren't just lines on paper. They were actions etched into muscle memory, and Alexander could tell exactly when a route shifted by monitoring whether his markers were dislodged too early or far too late. He began submitting repair requests for minor issues in various zones, timing how long it took for a technician to respond. He learned that urgent flags received attention in under 4 hours, while low-priority forms often sat ignored for a day or more, meaning a real intruder with the right disguise and timing could move freely through certain sectors for up to 36 minutes without raising any suspicion. The Soviets were not seeking immediate action. They were building a profile, a vulnerability map that measured routine, response, and laziness. Through Alexander's silent observations, they gained insight into when the base was at its weakest: early morning guard changes, during inventory checks, or during maintenance drills that scattered attention and thinned patrols. Even seemingly trivial details, like how long a motion-activated light stayed on in a storage corridor after someone passed through, helped gauge sensor calibration and delay timers. By the end of his 5th month, Alexander had recorded over 200 individual data points, all smuggled out in the form of sanitized reports, code words and equipment forms, and the occasional innocent-sounding letter mailed to an uncle in Kiev. Not once had an alarm been triggered. Not once had his presence drawn suspicion. And that was the brilliance of the operation. The Americans weren't being attacked. They were being studied. And because they didn't feel the impact, they never changed their behavior. The base remained confident, habitual, open in ways only a veteran eye could see. Alexander never needed to steal anything because the most valuable, intelligence was never locked away. It was walking around, repeating itself, and trusting that no one was watching, but someone was. And every chewed piece of gum, every unspoken delay, was a whisper of weakness he captured in silence. The first real moment of doubt didn't come from an officer, or a security chief, or anyone trained in counterintelligence. It came from a corporal named Jim Rawlins, who had just completed his 3rd month on rotation at the base, and who, unlike most of his fellow guards, hadn't yet been dulled by routine. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a moment at the end of a long shift, standing near the West utility shed, when he noticed something odd about the access panel. The latch gave slightly before it clicked into place, as though something soft was interfering with its closure. He opened it and found the faint residue of gum, darkened from dust and heat. At first, he assumed it was just a leftover from one of the civilian workers. Lazy, maybe juvenile, but something about it stuck with him. 2 days later, while stationed at a different sector, he saw the same thing. This time, the base of a manual override switch inside a rarely accessed maintenance duct bore the unmistakable, glossy smear of chewed gum. He didn't file a formal report, not right away, but he mentioned it during a casual conversation with a technician from systems infrastructure, who blinked, then said he had noticed a similar issue the week before, near the relay boxes behind the communications building. Just kids or lazy contractors, they both agreed, but a seed had been planted. The technician, a meticulous man named Ben Hanley, went back through his service logs and realized that over the past 5 weeks, there had been 8 minor maintenance requests, all involving panels or switches that had needed cleaning, clearing, or de-gumming, though the language varied. When he aligned the logs chronologically and mapped them, he noticed the distribution wasn't random. It formed a kind of arc around the southern and western edges of the base. He brought it to the attention of his supervisor, who skimmed the printout and shrugged. Probably the same idiot making rounds with candy, he said, before moving on. But Hanley didn't let it go. He flagged the report as a low-priority anomaly and forwarded it to the security protocol officer, who similarly dismissed it, but logged it in the base's weekly incident digest. For now, the gum was still viewed through the lens of annoyance, unsanitary, mildly disruptive, but not dangerous. Yet the word recurring had now entered the conversation. Patterns, even subtle ones, make security officers twitchy, and that's when the first formal question was asked. Not about espionage, not even about infiltration, but about procedure. Why hadn't this stopped? Why did it keep showing up despite the warnings, the cleanings, the complaints? No one had answers, only theories. And because the problem didn't rise to the level of threat, it was given a name that would allow everyone to sleep at night: maintenance irregularity, which meant that while a few individuals had begun to feel the itch of suspicion, the system as a whole was still asleep, just the way Alexander Petrov needed it to be. The gum vanished the same week the questions started, not in a dramatic sweep, not through a Titan crackdown or an emergency alert, just a slow, quiet disappearance that seemed to align too perfectly with the first signs of suspicion. No one noticed it immediately. The technicians simply filed fewer maintenance tickets. The guards stopped wiping gunk from their fingers. The incident digest shrank. And for the first time in over 2 months, the base returned to what it thought was normal. But Alexander Petrov was already gone. His last recorded entry on the contractor manifest was dated 12 days before the maintenance supervisor flagged the gum pattern to base security, and it was filed like every other. A routine service call on the electrical subsystems near the vehicle depot, signed off with a time-stamped exit log and a half-smudged signature that matched 6 others before it. His departure raised no alarm because, officially, there was no reason to think he'd done anything wrong. Petrov's contract expired naturally, a project completed. His badge was returned. His name removed from the gate log database 2 days later in an automated personnel sweep. If anyone thought to ask why they hadn't seen him around, they chalked it up to rotation, reassignment, maybe even a family transfer. The gum stopped, and the problem seemed to stop with it. In his absence, the base did what all organizations do when facing discomfort without proof. They cleaned. Panels were opened and scrubbed, hinges oiled, lock mechanisms replaced with newer models that had tighter tolerances. A memo circulated ordering that all contractor tools be inspected upon entry and exit. New cameras were discreetly added near the utility sheds and storage corridors. There were short meetings, polite but firm reminders about vigilance. A subtle but detectable tightening of posture. But it was theater. Necessary, reassuring, utterly belated theater. What none of them realized was that the very fact they could now articulate the pattern, now that the gum had formed a map in hindsight, meant the pattern had already served its purpose. Alexander hadn't needed to wait for them to catch on. He'd only needed the time it took for their comfort to become habit. And now, with everything cleaned and the base restored to its ideal condition, the Soviet intelligence report stamped with Petrov's coded name sat somewhere in a drawer in Moscow, complete with timing schedules, access routes, surveillance blind spots, and human response delays with time margins down to the minute. The base hadn't been breached, but it had been read. Like a machine with exposed wiring, it had revealed every vulnerability through repetition and trust. And now, just as those vulnerabilities were being patched, their value was already extracted and filed. The spy was gone. The gum was gone. And all that remained was the illusion of a threat resolved, when in fact, the true danger had always been the delay in noticing. The base hadn't been attacked, it had been studied, and what was stolen wasn't a document or a weapon, but predictability, and the naive belief that routine equals safety. In the end, it was never about the gum. The story of Alexander Petrov and the Bubblegum hack isn't a tale of clever gadgets or high-stakes action. It's a quiet, devastating lesson about how the Cold War was really fought. Not just with spies and secrets, but with patience, patterns, and the blind spots we build around routine. The gum could have been anything: a matchstick, a piece of tape, a pencil mark. It didn't matter. What mattered was that it was small, forgettable, and exactly the kind of thing a secure installation would overlook. The real weapon wasn't the gum itself. It was human nature. It was the assumption that a system designed for safety would remain safe so long as its procedures were followed. It was the trust placed in badges, in paperwork, in familiar faces, and stamped forms. And it was the base's failure to recognize that the greatest threats weren't the ones that kicked down the door, but the ones that quietly watched it open and close, day after day. Alexander never forced his way in. He didn't need to. The system welcomed him, as it welcomed anyone who looked the part and behaved predictably. He exploited nothing more advanced than habit. He mapped the unspoken choreography of a guarded place, when people got lazy, when they were hungry, when they were tired, and most importantly, when they stopped looking. And once he understood how the humans operated, the machines became irrelevant. It didn't take lasers or encrypted radio signals to find a weakness. All it took was knowing that the same guard lit a cigarette every day at 2:17 p.m. and left a back door unmonitored for 6 minutes. That the technician never locked the panel after replacing a fuse. That the cleaning crew walked past a keypad without glancing at it because they never expected it to change. That someone, somewhere, would always assume that gum was just gum. The Cold War bred entire generations of paranoia, yet it also built institutions of comfort within, their own systems. People convinced that so long as no alarm sounded, they were safe. But silence is what espionage thrives in. Petrov's mission wasn't to break the system, it was to learn it, piece by piece, until it exposed itself. And by the time the base realized something had been happening, the damage wasn't just done, it was permanent. This wasn't just a story about a breach. It was a mirror held up to every fortress that believes its defenses are invincible because they've never been tested by the right kind of enemy. The lesson of the Bubblegum hack is chillingly simple. If you want to see how secure something truly is, don't attack it. Watch it. Trust is the doorway, habit is the key, and all it takes to open a supposedly impenetrable door is the right pressure in the right place, at the right time, applied by someone no one ever bothered to notice. If this story made you rethink what espionage really looks like, you're not alone. We tend to imagine spies as dramatic figures, sprinting across rooftops, dodging lasers, hacking terminals with seconds to spare. But the truth? The Cold War was won and lost in silence, in forgotten corridors, in overlooked routines, in the smallest gestures that no one noticed, until it was too late. A piece of chewing gum, discarded, dismissed, ignored, became a listening device without a microphone. It didn't record sound. It recorded people, their habits, their laziness, their assumptions. And that's what made it powerful. Because espionage isn't always about breaking in. Sometimes, it's about watching a door long enough to know exactly when no one's watching it anymore. Imagine how many secrets have slipped through the cracks, never stolen, never traced, just quietly, observed. Imagine how many systems we think are secure just because they've never been tested by someone with patience. These are the stories we tell here, the hidden war, the quiet agents, the forgotten breaches, the missions no one ever wrote a movie about because the heroes never fired a shot. If you want more stories like this, about Cold War spies who worked in the shadows, about operations that used routines as weapons, and about how the smallest tools, like gum, receipts, lunch trays, or misplaced stamps, became the sharpest blades of all, then this is where you want to be. Subscribe to the channel. Join us for deep dives into history's most brilliant infiltrations, stories you won't find in textbooks, because they were designed to be invisible. Hit that like button if you believe real spycraft isn't about explosions, but about what people don't see. Tap subscribe so you never miss what the history books missed. And ring the bell, because sometimes the scariest threats don't make a sound. See you in the next true spy tale.